Howdy YouTube, I'm Ivy, and welcome to another speed paint / tutorial today. I'm going to be doing kind of a walkthrough of how I've been achieving this watercolor style that I've been experimenting with. I just started doing it, so it's not super duper refined, but it's getting there, and I thought that I would share the few tricks I've learned so far. My mom, she's a traditional painter. She does like watercolor, oil, acrylic, like all kinds of stuff. I personally don't do very much traditional work at all, but I really like her watercolor stuff, and it was just my birthday, so I thought it was kind of a fun girls' day out. I would just go on a paint out with her, and she would kind of walk me through how she does her watercolor stuff. And I really liked the result of it, and I thought, I don't really like traditional art very much in general, so I would try and kind of achieve that look in Photoshop, or at least try to. And I think that the results came out pretty good. The things that I've been doing keep on getting like favorited into collections for like traditional art, so apparently it's convincing. That's what I'm going for. So very cool. And you know, a couple of people have asked me how I achieved that look, so I thought I'd throw together a quick video. I think the main trick is to follow the sequence that you would with traditional art, because most digital art is like you do a sketch and then you do line art over it, and then you get rid of the sketch and you fill in the line art with like these very clean, refined lines for the most part. If you're doing this kind of line work, I mean, I know that painting is kind of different, but we're not talking about that today. Today's sequence is going to be doing kind of a cleaner sketch, like simulating a pencil sketch like you would have in like your sketchbook or you would do with watercolor, and then we're going to be throwing our quote-unquote watercolor on top of that in colors, and then kind of refine all your lines with a black quote-unquote pen. So I think it is pretty convincing. To start, I'll share my brush set that I'm using and maybe a couple extras so you can follow along with kind of the textures that I get. Depending on the brush that you use, if you use mine or your own, you might want to lower your opacity for the sketch portion, because you're really trying to go for this pencil look where you kind of start in broader, like light strokes and go deeper and refine. So just think about how you would do a typical pencil sketch. I mean, maybe not everybody would do their pencil sketches like that, but it's a good habit to get into to kind of make broad shapes and then pick out things from that. So let's get our sketch down. So once you have your sketch, it's time to start laying down your colors. Watercolor is super loose, and the nature of it is to be forgiving, so starting with lighter colors and layering it to get deeper and darker with shadows. So start by using a brush that has a watercolor look to it. It especially looks if it has the slightest bit of darkness around the edges, because that's where the paint pools and dries darker in real watercolor. So try to imagine that you're working in watercolors, and keep in mind that colors will bleed, be darker in some spots, softer in others, depending on how much pigment and water you're using. It's a little bit hard to describe, so I think that you're just gonna maybe need to do a little bit of watercolor painting to get the grasp of it, like in real life. But to achieve a realistic-ish look, I think it's important to keep these qualities in mind. The first time you go through these colors, they're not going to be super bright most likely. It's going to be some patience to go one section at a time. And the method that I was using to do watercolor, like my mom taught me, you would work one color, and then while you're letting that one dry, you kind of go to another section that's separate. It's funny because it's kind of like this like roleplay immersion, but I think that adds to the effect of keeping the watercolor feeling true to like the method that you would really use to do watercolor, because you're looking at it in a certain way when you do it that way. Because like in digital art, you can highly render one section at a time and then move on, but watercolor, you're forced to kind of work in a broad spectrum and slowly build that up with darker and darker colors, and that's part of getting a realistic look that doesn't look like you did it super refined in digital. This is going to be a little hard for me to describe, so bear with me here, but I'm going to be going over the kind of ways that you can achieve this watercolor effect. I think of there as being two sorts of ways to achieve colors in watercolor. One is like letting one layer dry, and the other is working with it still wet. Doing it dry, I would say, is definitely the easiest. This is kind of assuming that your paint is going to immediately dry. So you would put down your color, you know, say this is layer 1. If you were working in real watercolor, you said, okay, I put that layer down and now it's dry. So when I go over it again, it's going to be putting over a whole new color without assuming that there's going to be water there on it already. If there is water though, you can use a smudge tool or something like that and kind of blur these, and it will say, okay, now we know that this part was wet when we laid down our second pigment or secondary, you know, whatever. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the tools that you can use to achieve that look. The first thing is, you know, the watercolor brushes that you're using. I'm gonna supply a couple, so you should have some. So this is just a very basic shape, you know, you're laying down one thing. What you want to do is make sure that this layer is, or not layer, sorry, well actually the layer 2, but in this case the brush setting is set to multiply, and that means when you go over it a second time it's going to be darker. Yeah, so like this is one very basic way that you can do it, and you can keep going over it with different colors to achieve some really cool effects. And it keeps building on top of that base layer, which is very true to how watercolor really is. And then if you want to get that kind of soft, like, yeah, you were working on this while it was wet look, you can use a smudge or a blur tool to kind of blend these things together. The only problem I have with this is that it's a little bit hard to control if you're doing those all on one layer, which I typically do. So if you are planning to do a lot of blending, instead of going about it in this way, I would say, okay, lay down one color. Let's say that the next layer that you want to put on top of this is the one that you're going to have very blendy, but you don't want to affect the one underneath it. Just make another layer, and instead of using multiply as your brush setting this time, set your layer setting to multiply. Then you can set down your second one. And then if you're like, okay, if I was working in real watercolor, I would assume that this bottom layer is dry, but this top one is currently wet. That's the assumption that we're making right now. So if you're doing regular watercolor, you could take a secondary pigment or whatever and drop it down. Let's say I have this nice yellow shade on top of it, but I want to take my brush and put just a drop of blue in there and see what it does. So you could say, okay, I'll take some blue. I'm not really sure. I think I will set this to the brush setting to multiply as well. And then you have this one secondary layer. This is your new layer. It's also set to multiply. Lock this so you can kind of keep your hard edges if you like that. Here's my drop of blue. That's also really dark right now, but if you go in and smudge it like this, you won't be affecting the layer beneath it. I don't know, there's a lot of different things that you can do to kind of work with these settings that achieve a watercolor look, but it's all just a manner of really layering, I would say, in this case. So keep experimenting, and you might find some really cool effects that have a real watercolor look to them. And then once you're done with your colors, your final step, if you choose to do this, you can keep it in this loose form and keep refining it with watercolor, but I like to finish it off with a line art. I like to just use very basic black and white pen looking brushes to just go over it all and make it kind of defined, and it can really clear up some ultimate sins that you've done as you've done your coloring in this very sloppy, loose manner, just to kind of fix up what you might have messed with. And in the end, you just want to throw on this, the pretty white colored like a gel pen look to get that sparkly final effect. So the final thing that I'll leave you guys with is a tip on how to achieve this look of watercolor paper, because that's kind of a final texture that does a lot. You'll want to make a new layer and go to Edit, Fill, or Shift F5. It'll probably be on a color by default, but you want to go down to Pattern and then choose your custom pattern. These should be default loaded into Photoshop if you hit this little gear and then go down to Artist Surfaces. And we're going to be choosing this one right here. It is Gouache Light on watercolor. And we're going to be filling with that. It'll probably be on brick fill by default, and I like to personally use random fill. That will bring you up to this secondary screen where you can choose some different settings on how to do this. I want my density up really high so it totally fills up, the page. The minimum scale, maximum scale really depends on what size canvas you use, so it's partially personal taste, partially how big you work. So just, experiment a little bit, but it's kind of important to not have something that looks like it's obviously a pattern that you just set down that repeats. You want it to look large enough that it looks organic. And then you can mess with the color and brightness randomness a little bit. I like to have a tiny bit of variation. I think it's interesting. You won't notice the color and how I'm going to use it, but maybe there's other ways that you could use the color. Hit OK and you'll get this generated pattern. With this, you'll want to go over to the Channels tab right here, and there'll be this little button. It looks like a kind of an invisible circular thing, and you're going to load your channel as a selection. Then you can hide this layer, go down to the one that you have your painting on. It should all be on one layer, kind of. Maybe once you've merged down, if you're using multiple, this is a good time to do that. You can also put all of your layers into a group and apply this mask to a group. But you'll want to hit this little, I don't really know what you would call it, it's rectangle with a circle in it. And it'll create a mask with this texture on it. And you can kind of see, here I'll maybe use a darker color to kind of, you can see this nice texture built up on top. It will make your painting appear lighter. So there's various things that you can do about that, but if you have this mask selected, you can go to Image, Adjustments. You can use brightness or contrast, levels, curves, whatever you're most comfortable with, and adjust this so it's a bit darker. You can use kind of different settings, and it's important to keep that texture kind of on there while also keeping true to your colors. So you can mess with it however you like, and keep in mind, if you do decide to keep it very visible, like let's say I only put it like here, like it's still lightening up my picture quite a lot, you can see. But it never really hurts to just go over that with a curves layer and darken the whole thing, and it might keep some of that texture in a way that you like it a little better. There's so many different effects that you can use in Photoshop that just really brings things to pretty life. thank you guys so much for watching. I know this is a longer video, but hey, if you learned something, that's the point. So thanks so much for watching this little speed paint, and hopefully there'll be more in the future. Maybe I'll learn more watercolor tricks. Who knows? Let me know if there's anything else you guys would like me to make a tutorial on. I actually really like making tutorials. I'm not the most articulate all of the time, but I would like to get better at it. So let me know if there's anything that you would like me to walk you through how I do, and I would be happy to do it. Peace!